Hi, welcome to the June 1st, 2023 meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group. This user group is about people using any form of Kubernetes on top of VMware infrastructure, typically meaning the vSphere hypervisor. So it covers not just VMware's distribution Tanzu, but also people who want to run pure upstream open source or Red Hat, SUSE, or whatever distributions, as long as they meet the Kubernetes compliance test. This group will support Kubernetes activities. On the agenda today, we've probably got plenty of leftover time for people to engage in free-form discussion, but I thought I'd just briefly go over recent activity in the CSI and vSphere cloud provider, of which there isn't much, but I'll cover it anyway. Let me share my screen just so as I address these topics, you can see them. So on the vSphere 7 front, there was a release, an update release, a patch on May 3rd. It does not appear to be available in all the forms like ISOs, specifically OEM ISOs, but it addresses a pretty limited number of bug fixes. I looked through this list and it looked like it was primarily an issue where people on certain 1 gigabit NICs who upgraded to the last release, L, found issues, and this has fixes for those. For most users, well, you should probably look at the actual release notes, but I think you're still good on the prior release and not much has changed, but you're encouraged to look at it. On the vSphere 8 front, once again, no recent activity since April the 18th. There was a doc update on May the 9th. Typically, those are minor, and they didn't seem to have any call out of what they had changed, but I glanced through it, didn't see anything that caught my eye. The CSI plugin, no release updates in the past month. There's one issue reported on failing to get data stores, and investigation asked about whether the storage was mapped to every ESXi host node hosting Kubernetes clusters, and there wasn't a response. So I think that might be an isolated thing. And there was a doc update on May the 12th. Patch releases yesterday on the vSphere cloud provider. So this seems to be related to using IP version 6. So if you're not doing that, it probably doesn't concern you, but if you are, you might want to look at that PR. And then also this enhancement that says that they came up with a better user agent name that's easier to spot in the vCenter UI. So I gather this was an enhancement so that when the cloud provider starts some kind of process that might show up in the task list, it's easier to tell it, identify that it is such a thing as opposed to some user triggered activity. So that's about it on the update front. The other thing I put on the agenda was a note that this group, on request of the Kubernetes project, is being twilighted. And as of like this meeting, is likely to be the very last one. Now, the observation here, the reason this is being done is that when this group was initially formed, the expectation was that all of the cloud providers, and most of them being public clouds like AWS, GCS, Azure, would form their own user groups, and it never happened. And the VMware one was the only one that came about, and they no longer want to support a general category of user groups. The other observation is that much of the typical discussions we've had during these, and by the way, welcome, Bryson, I just noticed you joined us, has related to non-Kubernetes things that are more in the CNCF project camp, things like load balancers, ingress, you know, the things that are in Kubernetes I just addressed, like the CSI storage plugin, as well as the cloud provider. You kind of need those, but it seems that users often are faced with yeah, kind of the bulk of the issues can relate to more things like how do you do a load balancer on-prem, or how do you cover networking, service mesh. So there's a request to lift and shift this over to the CNCF and maybe broaden the mission scope to cover all aspects of on-prem. So this could be on a hypervisor, whether it be VMware's or some other one, and it could also be on bare metal. And a lot of these same issues, if you buy into this theory that some of the trickier concepts are things like your load balancer, or even how you maintain storage for Kubernetes when you're on-prem, they cross boundaries that go just beyond the VMware hypervisors. So this request actually makes sense to me, but things are moving slow. So I was given a deadline by the Kubernetes project of this month. So I'll abide by that. And frankly, summer is usually pretty slow for attendance anyway. And we've had an effort going to get people to sign up and start a group over under the CNCF that would be something along the lines of an on-prem user group. And in order to do that, they don't want it to be just vendors. In fact, I think the CNCF would prefer that it be almost no vendors. However, the reality is that it's typically vendors who are willing to pay somebody's salary to put in the work to keep a group like this going. And there is, I can tell you, having operated this for years, it is real work. I mean, if you've got a day job and you have to have a cadence of monthly meetings, you are going to spend some hours keeping that alive. So I've talked to a number of people who are interested in these topics. And certainly when we go to KubeCons and things, there's often a lot of camaraderie, even in physical meetings of users. And I think I personally would like to see this come up and reappear over in the CNCF, but it's going to take some work, and maybe some of you would like to help contribute to that. And I think the earliest we could possibly get this thing kind of on the air would be maybe September, but given typical summer vacation schedules, maybe that's just fine. And perhaps we could even get something popping up in terms of a physical meeting going on at KubeCon North America in November, if we've got something on the air. And if you're on the fence as to whether there's any benefit to you in joining or even help run one of these groups, I would say that there probably is. You get a lot of contacts where if you can say that, hey, I'm a tech lead or a user lead or a co-chair of one of these groups, well, historically, you may be able to get passes for KubeCon events and some kind of support for running them. But you also, I think, get a gateway to introductions with a lot of people as you're trying to bring speakers here. And I know I've learned a lot running this group. If we were to run an on-prem group, we could host presentations by people from load balancers. Ingress is now sort of deprecated, moving to Gateway API, but I think that act of getting involved actively with a group like that isn't just work. There can potentially be a lot of learning opportunity associated with it too. So anyway, that's my announcement. I'll open it up if anybody has any thoughts on this.
Well, seems I joined just in time for the last one.
And Robert, you were just telling me before we formally started how busy you were. So maybe it isn't you, but maybe you know somebody, as a customer in your organization that might be up to this. And you don't have to do it full time. I mean, Bryson has been a user sponsor of this group, and he shows up. I don't know, Bryson, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe a third or half the time. And I think you've gotten some value out of it.
Yeah, I definitely have found value.
I think
Or-
I think the problem is kind of what you said, Steve, is that in reality, many people are they're running a managed Kubernetes distribution.
Mhm.
And if it's in the data center on vSphere, good chance it's Tanzu. And if it's not Tanzu, it's OpenShift or Rancher. How large is the community that is doing generic roll your own Kubernetes on vSphere? It's probably a lot. But is that the kind of group?
Yeah.
That's probably the group that's been doing it for the longest.
Yeah, I think actually there may be large numbers of people doing it on their own, but when you get up to larger things like organizations and enterprises, I suspect it's way less than half. And a lot of them initially might aspire to doing it on their own, but I think that they discover that the expertise involved there and the support requirements are such that maybe it is of business benefit to kind of outsource some of this to others, particularly when it comes to maintaining security, because one of the issues you'll have with regard to CVEs and security patches is that by design, they aren't entirely open with those CVEs as they are first reported. And the only way to get hooked into that path is really to be a vendor. There might be some other one, but I'm not aware of it. And I think for good reasons, just so that hackers couldn't self-identify, as a user and get early looks at 0 days in order to exploit them, that they've got kind of a gate on that. And if your use of Kubernetes is in the camp of being an application where you've got security risks and concerns, I think that there's a lot of pressure to use a commercial distribution.
And the people supporting those commercial distributions, they're going to, for help, going to stick to the communities around those distributions.
Yeah.
Because they'll find far more specific help there than in the generic CNCF community.
Yeah, I think coming to a user meeting like this isn't a great place to go resolve your security issues other than kind of generic principles of what you need to be worried about. I think that the typical topics you could discuss in a forum like this would be things, kind of general purpose Kubernetes things for on-prem, like I'll just throw out an example, but I could probably come up with a list if I spent an hour, a dozen of them, or ChatGPT could do it for me in minutes. But take, for example, putting resource constraints on your workloads. It's something that early adopters to Kubernetes often don't appreciate, because you come across training classes that just say, put together this YAML, and indeed the stuff runs, but you haven't disclosed kind of your expected CPU memory consumption of these workloads. And what happens on-prem is, unlike public cloud, where you've got actual elastic expansion, should you be willing to pay for it, if you misuse these things, you just get a big bill at the end of the month. You end up on-prem where you don't really have a pool of idle servers sitting around, or at least most people probably don't. If something goes south and some workload you're running, maybe it's even a bug, goes and has a memory leak and starts gobbling things down and starts causing out of memory exceptions, the things killed aren't necessarily the perpetrators. And, there are best practices when you're running on-prem that maybe there's still best practices in a public cloud, but the repercussions of taking shortcuts, I think, on-prem there are more hardcore than they are if you're in a public cloud, where it would run up your bill, but you wouldn't go off the air. And there are other aspects that we've covered here. By design, most of the VMware distributions are not prescriptive on things like a load balancer. So when you're in a public cloud, they're going to have one, whether you like it or not. They're going to have a solution for, routing IPs, even what IPs you use. But when you're on-prem, that stuff by design is left up to you, just because there's often interop with legacy things that still need those same kind of features, like a load balancer or a firewall. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for discussion of issues that are unique to running Kubernetes on-prem, even discussions of whether Kubernetes is the right solution for being on-prem, frankly, because, that a common scenario is that people have legacy workloads that have been out there for a decade, frankly, work fine. How do you make the decision as to what, which of these make sense to port to Kubernetes or not? If you're in a public cloud, those things probably were born in a public cloud, although granted, you have the option of using the vSphere up in AWS and other public cloud providers. Yeah, sorry, Bryson, you couldn't stick. If you needed to discuss anything, ping me on Slack.
Yeah, sounds good.
And I did send you a DM on Slack about a conversation from the vSphere storage group. So if you're interested in that, let me know.
Yeah, I'll have to follow back up on it. I saw it and I was in the middle of something and totally forgot about it.
Okay. Yeah, as a sidebar, I got approached by some of the people on the vSphere team who are responsible out of the storage business unit, and they wanted to run by some, they wanted to have some one-on-one conversations with users to get wish list pain points and talk about future roadmaps. It probably isn't the kind of thing best suited for doing in this very meeting, because the thought was that people who have pain points don't necessarily want to be communicating those in a recorded YouTube video. So we're doing this with an opportunity to keep that a little more private, but just FYI, if any of the rest of you are interested, go DM me on Slack and I can help set up some of these meetings.
Yeah, also, again, a lot of the vSphere CSI and storage things will be related largely or in part to one of the commercial ways the CSI ends up most often being used, which is, again, Tanzu.
Mm-hmm.
So it's it's always this has all been a problem from the very beginning, is how these technologies are so closely aligned with each other. How do you clearly differentiate between the two?
Although even there, I think it's fair to say that right now, with regard to vSphere, you can get to storage like CSI. And if you're running persistent stateful apps and hosting that storage in Kubernetes, and you don't necessarily have to, you could choose to host a lot of that in VMs if you wanted to, and maybe that is smart to do depending on what those apps are and whether they're legacy workloads also consuming them. But an interface point that's rather interesting is, how do you do backups? Over in CSI, there is a lot of work in progress on doing snapshots to better support backups. Like, you've had that technology for a decade over on VMs, but it's new to Kubernetes hosted persistent storage. And that's kind of a generic issue that goes across commercial distributions.
Yes.
The distribution is tied to the actual storage being used, but the general concept of, even for newbies, what is a snapshot? What benefit is there? And I think it's fair to say that most of the Kubernetes distributions do not include a prescriptive backup solution. They might include a pure open source one like Valero, or in vSphere, there is a technique to back up VMs, the old VADP appliance, but it really is not probably the best way to back up these Kubernetes stateful things. It might arguably be a really bad way, because it's backing up whole VMs, not storage volumes. And often these distributions can lead you to a plain vanilla thing like Valero that maybe can get the job done if your needs are really simple, but there are other things out there like Kasten that add a fair amount of value in a commercial release of Kubernetes storage volume backups. Just backup used to be a field I was strong on. In fact, that's how I joined VMware when they bought my startup Avamar. But an example of this is that a simple backup is that you do a backup of a volume yesterday and restore it today, and it pretty much will work. But if you have legal requirements to keep these things around for 5 years and have access controls on these things, you can easily find that this backup, this storage had permissions associated with it that granted admin privileges to people who left your organization 5 years ago, and you bring them back and no one is allowed to read them. And the better solutions take it a step further than just the plain old, let's save it and let's restore it, and are capable of going in there and taking inventories and even patching things up. And the patch ups could be security permissions with policy controls, because you do not generally, it's usually a really bad day in my experience with backup if the backup vendor restores it and gives blanket permission to the whole world. That often even violates legal rules. But even if it does work, you've also got issues of doing restores across release boundaries of your software. So picture that this backup backed up a volume in Kubernetes 10, and now you're in Kubernetes version 20 that's years later. That often, if it's restoring things associated with these, like Kubernetes labels and things, the universe might have changed between those two eras where things just flat out get broken, and they are not expecting kind of ancient CRDs or ancient labeling to be present. And it could potentially be as ugly as destabilizing your Kubernetes cluster if you were to bring these in, or bringing something in that duplicates a current label. Somebody labeled something XYZ, deleted it. It's been gone for years. Somebody comes up with a totally different XYZ, and then somebody restores the 5-year-old one with name collisions. And there's a lot of value add in those. And I think there's an opportunity for discussing topics like that go across kind of Kubernetes to other project or product realms that are pretty generic and not related to commercial distributions.
Yeah, another big one is resource control. And you kind of mentioned it. We had a whole, separate Tanzu Tuesday talk just on this subject with some people, and that also is not distribution specific. How do you align? What do pod reservations and pod limits mean in the context of ESXi VMs and resource pools and DRS, and how do you align these concepts together to have a coherent and holistic data resource management strategy? Same goes for availability. Again, not distribution specific. How do I do zonal placement and align the traditional VMware storage models or storage replication models to the Kubernetes availability model? Does it even fit? The answer is no. But you can make it fit.
That's really complex, as you know. I mean, It isn't just storage availability zones, but often potentially the compute availability zone could be independent.
I'm currently working with a customer that is facing this very problem. It's very, very interesting. And without speaking to too many details, they deployed a Kubernetes distribution on a VMware stretched cluster on vSAN. That is, you can do that, but you have to think very carefully about placement. What you don't want to do in that case is stretch the cluster across the two data centers, because you lose predictability about how things will fail over. you'll only ever have a surviving control plane for Kubernetes on one or the other side. Will it come back in one piece when your split is restored? So there's all kinds of things there. And the interesting thing with this particular customer was they've been running Kubernetes for about 3 years on Stretch Cluster. So their application teams, the application owners, they all have been, started to learn this cloud native world under this assumption that infrastructure would, as they have in the last 10, 15 years, save their bacon if there's a data center failure, because infra was able to do what they've always been able to do with technologies like Stretch Cluster and guarantee the availability of the nodes, of the VMs. Well, at least that's what they figured how that would work. But of course, in reality, they never tested it, and Kubernetes would fail in strange and unexpected ways if you actually did it, depending on the failure. So now they have to move to a Kubernetes distribution where the vendor says, you cannot run this on VMware Stretch Cluster. It's simply not supported. Don't do it. So now they're forced to, for the first time in 3 years, now to really think about their availability. And I'm helping them doing that. But it's absolutely fascinating because you're forced to then really create this aligned model between all these different technology layers. And there's no single vendor that's able to do it because each vendor looks at this problem through their own lens and their own products and their own technologies. But to do it properly, you need a holistic architecture. And that's a wonderful challenge to face, actually. I'm loving it. But it's a very difficult conversation to have with the customer because you have to completely realign their expectations about how to think about availability in cloud native.
I think that's a superset and maybe even a bigger problem I mentioned when it comes to availability and backup recovery, the problems of doing a backup and restore across a time boundary where maybe the Kubernetes release has changed, but potentially you've even switched to a different vendor or switched from one public cloud to another, from on-prem to public cloud or the other direction. And a lot of these can have tough repercussions. I don't even know that anybody out of the box promises to fix all of that. I'd be super impressed if somebody made that claim. I'd be really skeptical. And there's kind of these things over a time chasm, as well as one that's intended for disaster avoidance or site recovery kind of things, sort of like what you used to be able and still could accomplish in vSphere with Site Recovery Manager, where you could evacuate in a region if you knew something was coming or you had some planned maintenance. And I still don't think Kubernetes has evolved to where you can purchase that kind of thing as shrink wrap out of a box and just have kind of a guaranteed reference architecture that is proven to work reliably.
So there is actually movement in this space. It's one of the things I looked out for at KubeCon in Amsterdam, was exactly this area, because it's, it interests me. We have similar backgrounds when it comes to our old loves. I'm more of a storage guy, I'm more of a backup guy, right? But there is some movement there. You're seeing, so vendors like Dell, they are moving in the direction where they will basically obviously they're using technology that's backed by their storage solutions, right? But where they will go as far as to give you a reference design for a Kubernetes storage backend using that technology. But that's pretty new, by the way. There are, in the open source world, you have things like, you have Rook-and-Ceph, you have Longhorn, but I have yet to see any open source project or free software that can do cross-cluster replication, metro replication, asynchronous or synchronous, active-active. But Portworx, which is a spin-off from SUSE, like Kasten is a spin-off from Veeam or an acquisition, actually does have that technology, but it's a commercial product and does in-cluster storage abstraction, very similar to vSAN conceptually, and then also across cluster and at metro length. with exactly the same constraints and requirements that we're used to from Metro Cluster. 10 millisecond round trip latency and stuff like that. And that's a maturing space. I do think it's being pushed mostly by commercial vendors more than open source, because this is not a very sexy topic in the open source.
Yeah, the other thing, even
part of it.
historically, I think when it comes to storage, the guy who used to work for VMware, Chad Sakich, used to be my favorite commentator on storage, but he had an adage that it usually takes 3 to 5 years for somebody to really shake out a storage implementation to where it's truly reliable. Do you really trust some kind of open source project that just popped out on GitHub in the last X years and has a churn of the developers actually contributing to it? It isn't often for this stateful storage. You're kind of betting your job on it. And do you want to bet your job on that as opposed to a commercial vendor? I don't know. It's kind of your decision, but there's another aspect of this too with Kubernetes that I think is a challenge that often goes unappreciated until people sadly go and try to convince themselves that they've covered disaster recovery and avoidance in the stateful persistent volumes. And that is that really, practically speaking, if you move from one location to the other, a lot of stateful stuff is coming out of a registry or an image repository, things like, where do your container images go? Once again, if you're on a public cloud, you're pretty much likely to be using the one in the cloud provider just because of the economics rather than paying for standing up your own, unless you've got specialized governance needs. But, if you migrated even in a metro area from one site to the other and moved your persistent volumes, but didn't have your container image registry, your Helm registry, or whatever is keeping your packages. And there's a new trend where I think registries are expanding to where they used to call those things OCI containers, where C stood for container. And I think they should have called it content, because that spec was open-ended enough that they're putting all kinds of stuff, including WebAssemblies potentially. There's a growing chat. I went to a recent machine learning meetup where people in that space have machine learning inference engines running at edge or on-prem as opposed to in a public cloud. The training makes a lot of sense in the cloud, but really the goal is that you maybe run these machine learning inference engines at edge locations or on-prem locations, and effectively the pre-trained data is blobs, and it has to be moved around because it gets updated. And OCI containers are being looked at as a mechanism for that. And I think that that is in effect a mission critical storage backend that can benefit in many implementations, does benefit from replication, but it really has to be considered when you're talking about high availability, because moving and leaving that stranded behind is going to be a really bad day for you. And,
and the so this is being now colloquially called registry ops, right? And the funny thing is that, to your point, when you're thinking of an availability design, it's always more than just what's running in Kubernetes. One of the things I'm discussing with this customer is, well, which of your applications actually need to be replicated? How, most of these are stateless. Most of them simply need to be redeployed. But to redeploy them, you need your registry, you need Git, and you maybe need your pipelining tool. So then the cross dependency becomes, how do you make sure those three tools are,
you're right. It hadn't even occurred to me that Git dependency. So you probably maybe want a cloud hosted single point of truth Git that maybe use localized Gits. I'm designing air quotes here, but that seems like it would work on first impression, but you damn well better design it.
Well, exactly. Well, each of these tools will have their own availability methodology, right? A harbor, you can do with most registries, you can do registry replication at the registry level. So I can just have two harbors and one syncs to the other, right? Perfectly fine. But then I have to think about, well, if I have two harbors, I have two different URLs for those registry images. So how do I make sure that those URLs are updated on the other side? And then you have to think about things like, mutating webhooks that only apply when we're doing failover. So it can get very complicated. But there are strategies here, but you have to break it down and look at each of these components and look at their interdependencies. And you have to kind of think of the thing holistically. I mean, that's a big cultural shift, because we're infra, we've started to learn through very powerful technology that we can just infra will solve it, and we can do everything in one way. But in the cloud native world, unfortunately, things are more custom, and you have to look at have to break things down a bit more. And just like making an effective application architecture requires you to really kind of know what you're doing in the cloud native world. The same is true for that same architecture's availability design. You can't just simply leave it down for anymore to solve. Steve, if it's okay, shall we shift back to what we're going to do maybe around community?
Sure.
As this is the last session of this particular.
I don't think I'll be hosting another Zoom meeting. I am going to still be, the channel isn't going to go away. And I'm told that I'm a little lax on uploading the recorded videos, but maybe a few months behind. And they're not going to disappear the record of the recorded meetings up on YouTube.
One of the funny things is that if you look at all of the VMware open source projects, all the projects around the VMware ecosystem that are in the open source community that are out there, and I mean, just within the CNCF, you've got Antria and Harbor and Cartographer and Contour, right? And you've got the RabbitMQ operator, and you've got all these things, right? And then you've got obviously the kind of more of the the plumbing stuff, like the cluster API provider for vSphere, the cloud provider for vSphere, CSI. So take all of those projects together, and you have a pretty substantial community, actually. I was just checking the Kubernetes Slack, and it's funny because in the provider vSphere channel, at the top is still your old link to the SIG VMware meeting with the old notes. It's still up there as a pinned topic. So that's going to be 2 generations old now.
Things have clearly morphed because this was originally a SIG, and it owned what was the in-tree storage provider along with the in-tree cloud provider.
Exactly, because it was in-tree at the time. The thing is that if the channel is quite active, right? And the vSphere CSI, they have their own channel, don't they? Well, the cluster API vSphere channel is quite active, of course. But what is unfortunate is that VMware is a little bit spotty in which of their projects they really try to do the open source community thing around, and which they don't. Because like things like Antria and Contour and Carvel are examples of really well-run communities with a community manager attached, and they have their own meetings. So that's really well organized. But then some of these parts, like the CSI, the providers, they don't have their own meeting. They don't have a community manager attached, at least not by VMware. And that's a shame, because if you look at that whole landscape, there's actually quite a lot of stuff going on. So I've always felt there was a place for a meeting like this, but it's all a little bit fragmented.
The other alternative is, like I say, the Kubernetes group, effectively, to put it crudely, they want us out. Now they've given us the option to go to the CNCF, and I think the CNCF would host us, but it won't be VMware specific. If your point is you want a VMware specific, maybe we'd almost have to do that by shifting into vMug or something, and that might be another option to consider, where it really effectively at that point becomes vendor run. However, I think that there's a downside to that, in that if it's under the CNCF, I think we have an opportunity for like getting sessions at KubeCons and recruiting speakers out of other CNCF projects, maybe a little easier than if it were. You never know. I mean, that's speculation. True. Maybe under vMug we could still get that kind of participation. But
I had an alternative idea, which I'll float. So there is a growing community around the concept of platform engineering. There is an extremely active Slack around the platform engineering topic. And a lot of that infrastructure is actually backed by a consultancy called Humanitech. And the interesting thing, so that besides platform engineering being kind of the du jour kind of thing right now, around within the CNCF ecosystem and wider, at the same time, and this is, I recognize this is KubeCon, is there is going to be an increased attention to the on-premise situation. We're seeing a little bit of cloud repatriation happening, but more dramatic than that is the fact that we're 6 years, 6, 7, 8 years into this Kubernetes journey. All the vendors, the big software vendors, right, have now they've caught up with their skill sets, with their developers, with their application methodologies. And some of those big vendors, think IBM, think SAP, are now ready to bring out the next version of their software as Kubernetes native. And they are starting to talk to their customers saying, listen, the next version of SAP might just be container-based. And you better have a Kubernetes distribution sitting there on premises, ready to go for our whole SAP version to land on. Enterprises, by and large, still are not ready for this. So there is this new wave coming that will focus back on the enterprise and the on-premises space. So bearing that in mind, maybe restart this under more that platform engineering type of.
Could you shoot me a link to that platform engineering group? Because this is perhaps new to me. Yeah. I'd like to look into it. The other thing I'm going to throw out there in terms of this wave to on-prem, and I might be biased because frankly, maybe VMware is in a position to make better margins in on-prem versus cloud. I don't really know. It's not my job level, but I actually am a believer that this big awakening with regard to AI and ML is going to create a strong impetus to move back to at least metro areas. A lot of this is political data privacy regulations and legitimate concerns about having these models and sharing your data that's proprietary in these public clouds, helping to train a shared model like ChatGPT. That is just, I think that people, maybe with some early adopters discovering this the hard way, that's just lunacy if you're most organizations, and it might in fact even be illegal, even if it would work. And there's no putting that genie back into the bottle. The AI ML, there are just such, every week I see a new eye-opening demo of, oh my God, I didn't think that you could do that. And this is going to happen. And I think it largely is going to happen on-prem.
Yes.
Maybe instead of on-prem, it will be kind of a resurrection of even like colos and metro providers.
I think it might be.
But still, the concepts of being on-prem are pretty similar if you go with a colo. And even if some of these people like CDNs get into that business, they're going to have to stand up this, and the issues are still there. And maybe the real issue is, you're not willing to be lax enough with your data to have it be multi-tenant in the big 3 or 5 public cloud vendors, and you probably aren't with your CDN provider either. Where you're going to care about this being a unique host. There's even some really interesting aspects of this are even that you're not going to do that AI ML without acceleration in hardware, and hypervisors like vSphere kind of own the space with hypervising general purpose CPU hardware. And there are some spot solutions that kind of tried to call it generation 1, or maybe it's generation 0.5, considering how rapidly things are moving with AI ML accelerators, that I think are going to cause huge unleashing of R&D funds to make this change really rapidly, kind of in general purpose CPU, Moore's law, really was there, and now it's a legend where you don't really see that doubling of transistors every 18 months. Or if you did, you could double the transistors, but it won't result in double the workload. But in ML, the stuff is moving so fast that it might be at a, nothing grows to the moon, but at a temporary pace that's even going at a ramp above Moore's law in terms of what's out there. I did a spot check for my IoT Edge group of just trying to find what is out there for edge accelerators. And I quit after I hit like 16 vendors who have come out with some chip accelerators for edge on-prem in the last 12 months. Effectively, it's everybody. And I found articles saying the VCs couldn't write checks fast enough for this.
Absolutely, So so the combination of enterprises taking Kubernetes, enterprise vendors especially taking Kubernetes more seriously, ready for that movement now, AI and the edge case, and especially the combination of the last two as well, and connected with that, the whole DPU kind of movement. I think on-prem is coming back in a big way, and I think that also just thinking of this now. I know, again, talking to people at KubeCon and Cloud Native Rejects and the Kubernetes community days, that this awareness is not big in the CNCF core ecosystem, right? They're very public cloud-minded, but when you worked around the solution exchange, you could tell by the vendors there were strong edge plays by, say, Canonical and VMware, Rancher is always a big staple there, as is VMware. The enterprise is there, and it's getting bigger. And things like observability, standardization of observability, consolidation of the kind of networking stuff it's getting very enterprisey when you look at the latest developments in STO and Cilium, and the hardcore networking, and then there's security, and then there's AI. So these are all traditionally pretty enterprisey type subjects, and I think that's becoming a bit of a shock to the system for some of the younger people within the CNCF core community. They're not used to this. And I think there is an absolutely huge skill set and just gap there that needs to be filled. Some of it will come from vendors, some will come from consultancies, but there's also a community gap there, which can be filled. So the platform engineering thing is one part of it, but we did notice, right, that there's a platform engineering white paper from the CNCF. And I'm just wondering whether there is room in the CNCF still for an on-premises community represented by a community meetup and a Slack channel and a formal structure. I'm just wondering. It's just,
Well, I think a lot of this is that you don't wait for the CNCF to do it. They really are open to this, to where if you want to make it happen, you can generally go in there and make a proposal. And if you give a succinct, compelling argument, you can make it happen. What you do have to do, though, is they start looking at things like diversity of vendors, diversity on other metrics other than vendors, and geographic diversity, and they will generally put something together. I mean, none of these organizations are going to survive long run unless they respond to what's changing out there in the world, right? I mean, that would be a recipe for being irrelevant in a decade or so. I think even the leadership of the CNCF knows this. There are things coming together, like I do host this Edge group, which is Edge pretty much is on-prem, but also combining that with low resource. And here, I posted a link in a chat. This is early stage, where some people from Cisco and IBM wanted to put together a white paper on what they're calling patterns, kind of put together a scope for some of the common concerns you'll see. And it's in early comment stage, where I think there's a lot that could be legitimately criticized as missing aspects or something, but this is occurring within the CNCF now, and it happens to be within IoT Edge. But I think on-prem in a data center context is not the same as what's going on in edge, so it might merit its own. And you could be right that maybe the platform engineering is a better place to do it, but it should be done someplace. And with this group going down, if you want to try to help me pop something up somewhere, I'm willing to put in some hours to try to make it happen. And maybe it isn't ultimately you. I know you work for a larger organization that has interests in this space. And if anything, the kind of organization you're in that helps users with integration architectures and whatever. Wow, the opportunities have to be mind-boggling with all of this technology being released, particularly the AI ML. I think that if I have never been in sales, but if I was, I just hallway track things at KubeCon is that I think every organization now sees a potential existential threat if they don't get caught up and figure out what's going on with AI ML. Even if they're coming upon hard times and there's a recession, there are always certain things that can unleash some greenfield spending. And at least in the US, it's kind of becoming a standard Wall Street analyst call when you do your earnings report of, what's your risk of being put out by a new startup that takes away your business because they embrace AI ML and do it in such a better way that you're gone. And you have to have an answer to that. And it isn't that, we'll look into that someday. They kind of need to say that they've got some ongoing activity there, which to me tells me that, they're writing checks and they undoubtedly don't have expertise in-house, so that if you could compose, an outside vendor to outsource that for them, there's got to be huge opportunities there.
Yeah, I'm going to be very curious to see what the solution exchange looks like in KubeCon Paris, or even the next one in the US.
Yeah.
Considering the amount of venture capital is being pumped into this exact area.
Well, in Amsterdam, certainly the hallway track was AI ML, but actually the exhibit hall, it was not. I think a lot of vendors, just like a lot of users, that it's almost like this Chat GPT gave a wake-up call around March of this year to the whole world.
Yep.
And it's new to everybody. Vendors who I almost wonder if half the vendors who are saying they have it aren't just mostly, blowhard liars. And they cobbled something together a week before the show. And
kind of like Google Bard. I think that's true. But this space is going to move really quickly. And to your point, and also public cloud, it's probably too expensive to do it there. Training a large regenerative model.
Well, I'm hearing now that it's so much in demand that you can't even get those large GPUs to use. And the price gouging, I suspect, is there as well, to where, if the cloud vendors just look at NVIDIA's performance in the stock market, and I suspect they can sell everything they can make and probably could sell more, but they're capacity constrained. That tends to be a situation where prices aren't going to be getting any cheaper, and people who have them are going to want to get big margins on it, which tells you that maybe doing that on your own, even if it isn't already desirable from a information privacy and sovereignty reason, is going to be valid as an economic reason. The only thing I'll say is counter to that is that I believe that the way things are being operated today, training is an intermittent kind of batch thing that you don't need running 24/7. So if there's a way you could call it timeshare in the old days of sharing that capital expense with others, that might make a lot of sense. But the inference, on the other hand, that is clearly on-prem. Okay, we're nearing the top of the hour. As usual, it will be sad if this goes away, because I typically, even with no agenda, there are some fascinating conversations. If you want to get involved at this point, I'd say just, where to find me on Slack, or Todd, if you don't, I'm there as Steve Wong on the Kubernetes Slack, and I'm interested in causing something to pop up somewhere, maybe in a fall time frame. I probably have time to put into it. And I think that's key, that you need some people who maybe have their employer justify spending some reliable hours on it on a recurring basis. How reliable I am, given the Broadcom merger, that's beyond my pay grade too. But I'm willing to try to get it started. So keep in touch and let's follow up on this.
So yeah, so Steve, I'll be so bold as to say on behalf of everyone who has been a guest here over the time, and I know I haven't been around recently, but and everyone who has watched these recordings on YouTube, thank you for doing this and for keeping to push it for so long.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. It encourages me to try to get this to continue on in some other form. So I really appreciate that coming from you. Thanks a lot. Okay, with that said, it's 11:59, so let's close this on that high note, and let's aspire to getting together to chat either in Zoom or in person going down the road. Bye, everybody.